It's my pleasure and honor to welcome a former student of Monmouth College and now a professor of literature, of writing at American University, Melissa Scholes Young. Write it down. And if you go to melissascolesyoung.com, you'll get a fuller statement about who she is and her accomplishments. Just briefly, before I forget, this afternoon at 3 o'clock in the Mellinger Center, she will be talking about her experience as a first-generation college student, which is invaluable when it comes right down to it. Even if you're not first generation, it would be useful to hear that. But if you can't, she has a link to an essay that she published in Atlantic magazine last year, in which she discusses what it means to be a first-generation student in college, as well as what it means for a teacher to have been in that situation. 6:30 tonight, write it down, 6:30 tonight in the Morgan Room. You all know where the Morgan Room is? It's over in Poling Hall, okay, on the second floor. She will be reading excerpts from her recently published novel, Flood. And of course, if I can be informal, Melissa, because she was always Melissa to me when she was here. Melissa and I were talking about the irony of the title of the novel, because the flood is both real and metaphorical in her novel, but it's of the Mississippi River. She grew up in Hannibal, boyhood home of Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. And the novel itself is a wonderful evocation of, I'm going to have to rip off Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi, or Nearabouts on the Mississippi. A wonderful evocation of someone who has to leave Hannibal just after she's graduated from high school, moves to Florida, and then has to leave Florida to come back to Hannibal 10 years later. And the characters are well honed, very clear, and very complex in their needs and desires. So, one last thing here before I invite Melissa Scholes Young to the podium. I'm going to embarrass her. She's already threatened to embarrass me when she gets up here. But I have to tell you that I have an image, a memory, from over 20 years ago. She graduated here in 1997. An image of my holding on to a lectern, a smaller one than this is, in Wallace Hall in the Mary Crowe room. I don't know if that lectern still is there. Is it still there? I don't know. But I would hold on to it just to prop myself up. And in the peripheral vision, off to my left, in the front row, every time, with paper and pencil or pen, writing furiously. Take notes, okay? They mean a lot. They're going to help you out a lot. And that is principally what I remember about her, is that, yeah, and then she throw her head around, one way or the other. Always timely, always prepared. I was not so timely in returning work, but she was always timely in getting it to me. This final exam. It's dated May 7th, 1996, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's signed Melissa Scholes. There was no young part at that time. That was in the future. I saved several papers in decades that I was teaching here. This is the favorite one. I could have given it to her the next year because she was still a student. But I think I probably forgot. But when I was asked to do this, I said, I think I still have that paper because it was so well written. It was off the top of her head, in class for a final test, not a cumulative exam, and amazing. I had it, and I made a copy of it for myself, but I want to return the original to Melissa Scholes Young. So please welcome her up to the stage while I return to the
We recycle now. we recycle. She taught us that trip, how to recycle. When I went home with her to Chicago, she would have us get an entire loaf of bread and make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to pass out to homeless people whenever we were down in Chicago. And I remember that. When she and I moved to Washington, D.C. together, our senior year, we called it studying abroad from the Midwest. And we met a boy one night, and I remember he had long hair and earrings, and he quoted Jack Kerouac. And I remember she said to me, "He'd be really good for someone like you." So I married him. I remember staying up all night with the other freshmen on my dorm floor, trying to understand why Dr. Smolinski made us endure Clockwork Orange, a communal viewing of Clockwork Orange together. And many of us were sick from the very, very graphic nature of Clockwork Orange, which is kind of the point, you see, of Clockwork Orange. So we stayed up all night long, debated it until dawn, and made round after round of macaroni and cheese in my dorm microwave. And those are the things I remember. Those are the things I wish for you too. If you only remember one thing from today, I want you to remember that you are here to learn to think for yourself. That's your entire goal over the next couple of years. You're here to find out people that challenge your way of thinking, and you're here to question what you've been taught, and more importantly, you're also here to question what you are about to be taught. You're here to make mistakes. You're here to take risks. You're here to learn to take care of yourself, and maybe more importantly, each other. And you're here to grow your mind. Dr. Suda, my mentor, and truly the kindest teacher I've ever known, began teaching me that when I accidentally ended up in his class my freshman year. And I'm going to begin with that story. I don't even know if he knows this story. One of the things that I always do on the first day of class at American University in Washington, D.C. is ask my students if they are absolutely positive that they are in the right class. I make them get out their schedule, they look at the room number, I remind them that I'm Professor Schultz-Young, I ask them if their intention is to learn to write, I make them double check it again, everyone has their schedule out, I walk up and down the aisles, I'm double checking. They think it's very funny, I'm funny, we laugh, and then I tell them about how ending up in the wrong lecture was actually the greatest mistake of my liberal arts education. I don't remember the name of the actual class that I was supposed to be in, but I'm pretty sure my schedule said 302. So I climbed the steps of Wallace Hall, found the number, claimed my seat, as Dr. Susan said, always in the front row to the right first. I'm a Virgo. Any other Virgos in the house? Right? We know where to sit. We have our pens, we have our papers, we are ready to go. We are always there first in the classroom. So I readied myself, and I should have noticed that the other students around me were very comfortable. They were relaxed, they were leaning back in their chairs, some of them were late, they all knew each other. It was very clear that they were not freshmen like me. Dr. Suda strode in, he strides, if you've seen him across campus, he strides wherever he goes. And he started reading poetry by Anna Akhmatova, and I still remember the poem. He goes like this. He loved three things in life: Vespers, white peacocks, and old maps of America. Didn't love children crying, raspberries with tea, or feminine hysteria, and I was his wife. I think he read it in Russian, I don't really remember, but I was absolutely mesmerized. I had never heard Russian, I had never heard poetry, and certainly not poetry written by a woman. The class was Russian cultural history, and I was definitely not somewhere a few floors below me, there was another class, maybe an introductory one, with freshmen studying something much more introductory than the senior or junior seminar. But I left the class, pretended I was supposed to be there, and just declared myself a history major. I thought it was easier than admitting that I was in the wrong classroom. And it turns out to really have been the best mistake of my liberal arts education and the best learning that happened when I was at Monmouth. I didn't know what a history major was actually going to do. I had come here and promised my parents that I would study business because that makes sense. My family has a pest control business, and so we know business, and so it makes sense. But it didn't make sense to me, and I didn't know how Russian poetry was going to help me in life. But I knew I knew I wanted to come back, and I knew I had to figure out a way to make it work toward a degree. Mark Twain, as Dr. Suda mentioned, who also wrote in my hometown, says that travel is fatal to prejudice. And I think a liberal arts education encourages you to travel with your intellect, to go on a journey with your mind. I think that's what books can help you do as well. As a first-generation college student, I chose my classes, because I didn't know any better, by going into the bookstore and just wandering up and down the shelves. Back then we had these things called bookstores. And you could go in them, and all the books were coded according to the classes. And I would just walk up and down the aisles and decide which class had the most books. And books I'd never heard of, and places I had never even imagined. And that's actually how I would choose my books. I wish for you, parents like mine who wander, my parents were they dropped me off here in 1993. It was a very, very long time ago. But they found a way back today. I wish for you parents that are willing to put up with your insatiable appetite for books, who encourage it, who tolerate your need to dissect every single thing that is said in and out of books, and then encourage you to write it all down on the page for maybe the world to read. You're in college because there's something that you really want to know. It may be about the world, it may be about your family, it may be simply about yourself. But I hope that it drives you to ask questions, and more importantly, I hope that it drives you also to sit with really uncomfortable, uneasy answers. Because I can promise you if the answer is easy, it's probably the wrong one. Usually the right one, a winding path. The writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez said that human beings are not born once and for all on the day their mother gives birth to them. Rather, life obliges them over and over to give birth to themselves. And to me, when I read Marquez, I know he's talking about the value of a liberal arts education. So the question is, how do you actually give birth to yourself, if that was your task in a liberal arts education? I think you have to try things on. If you end up in the wrong class, maybe you'll fall in love with Russian culture history. But I think you have to try things on. I think you should take an art class over in the Conference Hall, especially if you're not an art major. Take an art class over there. Maybe take one where you get to draw naked people. I always wanted to take one of those. Maybe learn piano. I earned the only B- of my entire academic career the semester that I tried to learn piano. I'm actually not good at it at all. I'm terrible at it. But when I would go to the practice rooms in Austin Hall, I fell completely in love with solitude, because those are really quiet rooms. And when I was practicing the piano, I was so bad at it, I wanted to stop. But I learned that there were stories in my mind, and that I could not write them down quick enough. And so I would go to the practice rooms and, no surprise, not actually practice, but just simply write. I would encourage you to try to take a class that's just pass-fail. Something where you get to go to the class and simply listen to other people talk and discuss something that you don't know anything about. Try a poetry seminar with Professor Wright, who was kind enough to invite join a club that you're pretty sure you'll hate. You know, when you walk past the billboards and you see all the advertisements for all the different clubs and you think, I don't want those people. I'm definitely not going to like those people. That's the club you should join. Simply to listen, simply to find out who they are. If you can't pronounce it, I definitely think you should eat it. That's been a very, very strict rule in my life. When the guy from Texas corners you at a frat party to tell you about the time he learned to bake from his deaf aunt, listen, take notes. Seems a bizarre conversation at the moment. It will work its way into a novel later. Intern, do community service. I thought I would go to law school. I thought that was a compromise, right? I wasn't going to do business, and I had no aptitude for sciences. I'll go to law school. So I did an internship with the prosecutor's office one semester and with the defense the next semester. And I learned very, very quickly, even though I loved studying law, that I would be a terrible lawyer. And I think it's as important to learn the things that you do want to do as it is to learn the things you do not want to do. What I learned is that lawyers deal with a lot of paperwork, and they have desks, and they have to be places on time. And I'm not good at any of those things. Being a college professor is much better suited. So, intern, do community service, lean into whatever it is that makes you uncomfortable, especially if it's a classroom discussion that you disagree with. Resist the familiar. Part of why I wanted to come here was to not leave my hometown, but to find people that aren't as familiar to me. Don't pretend that you already know everything. Because you're smart, you made it to college, you got the ticket, you're here, but you don't know everything. And I don't know everything, and Dr. Susan doesn't know everything. And the truth is, we can all see that already. A liberal arts education is something that you simply have to earn. We cannot hand it to you with your diploma. It doesn't work like that. You either learn to think or you don't. But you have to go through the process in order to do. In my case, a liberal arts education taught me how to write a book, which is also something that you really can't teach. You have to go through it. 28 drafts in 5 years, and there's a lot of mistakes in the page. A liberal arts education also taught me how to ask hard questions in a nonfiction work, and how to sit with, as I mentioned, those really uneasy answers sometimes. As a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences, I'm often asked whether a liberal arts education will actually lead my debt-laden students to a job, to a career. And I think it's a valid concern. My students and their families, just like yours, have made huge sacrifices for them to end up in my college writing class or in my creative writing class. And my duty is to teach them. It's my honor to do so. But I understand the concern of looking years ahead and making sure that this investment is completely worth it. And I'm here to tell you it will lead to a job and a career. I actually think more importantly, it will lead to a life. When invited to return to Monmouth and tasked with welcoming you to campus to share what I know about liberal arts education, I did what you do. I Googled it. I went to Wikipedia. I'm kidding. I didn't do that. You should stop doing that. Write that down. Stop Googling and stop going to Wikipedia. You know that's where you start. You just don't want to end up there. I actually went to one of the history textbooks that Dr. Suter provided that I loved around with me for years. And when I taught history also, I lived in South America for a few years, and I taught middle school history, and I used this textbook that I used in this class. And it's 700 pages of a brief history of the Western world. It's not brief, by Thomas Bear and Gavin Lewis. My copy is dog-eared, it has post-it notes in it, so every time I reach for it, things flutter out to the floor. And in the index, when you look up liberal arts education, you get liberalism. See also democracy. See also individualism. then chapters on revolutions that were fought to free minds, and the idea of equality and faith and reason and progress. You can get lost in the pages, as I do. And these revolutions, they look different, of course, in different places. But the idea that education was dangerous had been born. You see, the liberal is Latin for liberalis, which loosely translates as freedom. That's part of your job. Liberal education does not stand in contrast to conservatism. You can tell your parents to stop worrying. That's not what a liberal arts education does. Your parents shouldn't worry about that. In the lowercase, the arts actually refers to skill, or loosely translated as education. It's not the same as the uppercase arts that you hear politicians want to cut in their budget bills. It's not the same thing. So liberal arts leads to free thinking. And all the conservatives I know should love that. Long before modern revolution, Cicero, an ancient Roman orator, defined liberal arts as pay, libero, sunt digne, which means cerebral studies suited for freemen. And this is where I disagree strongly with Cicero when defining liberal arts. The idea that only freemen, those who are released from the obligation to work, those with leisure to learn. Forget free women, they didn't exist. But that the studies of liberal arts were only valuable to an upper privileged class, that they might be wasted upon practical service of tradespeople. I was raised by tradespeople. My dad was a pest control technician, my mother was a telephone operator. And they taught me how to work hard, to be proud, to do what I say I'm going to do. They taught me to take care of my neighbor and to know them. This is where I take issue with Cicero. It is true that when you are exhausted from a 12-hour shift in a factory, diving into the brief history of the Western world may be exhausting, but it doesn't mean that you won't, and it certainly doesn't mean that you shouldn't have access to it. I wouldn't give up the practicality that my family taught me for any fancy learning, but I'm also fortunate in that I never had to choose between the two. It used to be that liberal arts majors were portrayed as a luxury, something reserved for the elite, something perhaps only well-connected, affluent students could afford. But I'm happy to say that that stereotype across the United States is eroding, and I think with riddance. Liberal arts appeal is growing across socioeconomic spectrum, and employers are demanding more students with liberal arts education. In 2016, the National Association of Education, College, and Employers surveyed about 5,000 graduating seniors about their family's background and their economic status. The students most likely to major in humanities or social sciences, almost 34% of them, were the first generation in their family to earn college. And guess who is getting the jobs? Students with liberal arts education. Over time, liberal arts graduates' earnings often surge because liberal arts education is so very foundational, especially for students who pursue advanced degrees beyond college. History majors become well-paid lawyers, or in my case, underpaid writers. Philosophy majors use analytical and argumentative skills on Wall Street. International relation majors, they fly overseas as executives in big companies. But it's the liberal arts education that is foundational in getting those jobs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics predicts that in 2022, which is very near the year you'll graduate, 1 million more Americans will enter the workforce as educators. That's more than we have now. 1.1 million more will be in sales. Probably selling something, I'm guessing, hasn't even been invented yet. Each new wave of technology, and several have happened just in your lifetime, bring fresh demand for trainers, coaches, teachers, business leaders. how to be adaptable for that job. You'll learn foundational skills that can be refined for what it is that's next. That's what employers actually need. That's what they're actually asking colleges to send them. They can teach you, the employers can teach you the tech skills, but you have to have already developed the communication skills. And it's not just the job, it's the skills that liberal arts education is teaching you. In 2015, Laszlo Bock, who does all the hiring for Google, he said that prospective college students need to have a clear path to their major and their careers before they attend college. He advises you to declare your future job, to make a list of exactly the skills that you need before you even apply for admissions. Bock isn't wrong. We have bills to pay one day. I just think Bock is misled. The research shows that you can pay your bills better with a liberal arts education and be a happier, more productive citizen. And we need citizens that think for themselves. College isn't just about getting you a job. It's about getting you a life with lasting value. You've been gifted 4 years to figure out what you are, what you want to be, and I think just as importantly, who you are not and who you do not want to be. And your liberal arts education is the long run. It's not the short run. It's true, I hear this from my students, that Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, and Oprah, they don't have college degrees. You know this as well. But they do have the skills that liberal arts education provides. They're creative, they're risk takers, they know how to solve problems. Maybe they didn't need a degree to do that. And unfortunately, none of them actually have the degree to fall back on, just in case fame and fortune doesn't work out. So here are the skills that I know you need. You know you need to learn how to write well. That's the number one skill that employers are asking out of liberal arts education, out of all colleges, is to learn how to write well. You'll need to know how to analyze an argument, take it apart, to see how it is put together, and more importantly, how to answer it. You'll need to know how to look through an interdisciplinary lens in order to solve problems. The ability to navigate differences, to think critically about ethics and service. These are the skills that help you make polite conversation at dinner parties. And that's actually where you get jobs, is at dinner parties and cocktail parties and socials. That's where you get jobs. Carol Quillen, who's the president of Davidson College in North Carolina, recently wrote for the Washington Post about why liberal arts education matters even more in our current political climate. She said today's graduates need broadly transferable skills. They need to know how to communicate, how to build a team in a multicultural work environment, tackle an intractable problem, analyze complex data, and make timely decisions with imperfect information. Those are critical thinking skills. Similarly, graduates need the work ethic and resilience to learn new fields quickly, because what we train you for today might not exist tomorrow, which is why these liberal arts skills translate. She said that we need graduates and skills that can lead to a pluralistic free society, be deeply rooted human instincts that are harder to teach, like compassion, intellectual curiosity, self-awareness, integrity, and moral courage. Isn't that the world we want to live in? What she describes sounds pretty good to me. Most importantly, liberal arts teaches you about the quality of your life. I always think of the poet Mary Oliver, it's one of my favorites, and she asks, tell me what you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. Because you actually do get to choose. When I was a student at Monmouth, every day after dinner, I gave myself about 30 minutes to go to the library, which I just saw this morning. It's beautiful. There's art. You could wander around and look at art. We had books and microfilm machines that have been very good research. Have you ever seen a microfilm? It was a game I would play where I would go to the library and give myself 30 minutes to pick a book, any book, judging a book completely by its cover, and pulling it down off the shelf and just learning whatever I could learn, to whatever page it opens to, and trying to figure it out. It took 30 minutes a day. But I had a real insatiable curiosity, and I still do. I'm still never satisfied. I told my husband a few weeks ago, I think I'll go back to school. I know, he said the same thing. I don't know what I would do with it, but I'd like to go back again. I'd like to start over. I'd like to do it again. Back then, I understood that there was a lot I didn't know. I figured that out very, very quickly. And I also learned that the other students, the other freshmen, were much better prepared than I was when it came to my life. I hadn't written more than a few paragraphs in a senior paper. The high school that I went to was for the most part preparing us for vocational education, for jobs, and not as much to go to college. So when I arrived, I learned very, very quickly how far behind that was. Dr. Porter actually handed me a composition textbook my sophomore year and said, "You really, really don't know how to write at all." And so I went to the library and read this book about how to write an essay, and I found that there were these things called thesis statements, references, paragraphs, organizational elements. It was amazing to actually learn that, and then I learned how to write an essay that way. And it's part of why I still teach college writing, because I know I get students in the classroom every year who knew as little as I did, and that is the most important skill they're going to need throughout their entire college career, and probably in their life, to be able to write well. Every spring at American University, I also teach a class called The Art of Activism, Reading and Writing Protest. And it's very disappointing to my students to find out that I'm not actually going to teach them how to protest. They take the class because it sounds good, right? Art of Activism, right? And at American University, we pride ourselves on being the most politically active campus in the entire country. So when you hear what's happening at Berkeley, we can compare to what's happening at American University. So they come into class ready to learn how to protest, and they're a bit disappointed that that's not what I'm actually teaching. I'm teaching them how to write. And I'm teaching them how to write well so that whatever it is that they care about, they can get their voices heard in a very, very noisy world. We always begin with the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. And I read the entire thing out loud. Not that long. But there's something about hearing it out loud. I think Douglass understood the power and the responsibility that you actually have in your seats today. And I do mean responsibility. And because we can, we then take the train downtown to Anacostia and actually go to Frederick Douglass's house. He has a perfect view of the White House, where he could just stand up from his desk and walk down and knock on the president's door and get his voice heard that way. For me, part of the reason I teach Douglass first is because it's so foundational in activism and so much an example of how to use the pen to say something that you want to in the world. But also because he is so unbelievably compassionate and wanting to understand the mind of his oppressors, which is probably not how I would think if I were a free slave. He wanted to understand their evil so that he could answer it, and had to listen harder to it in order to be able to know which of his intellectual tools were most necessary in understanding it. He is stunningly compassionate because he thinks that his slaveholders have simply not been taught how to think critically enough, where they would come to a different conclusion. He is so sure of it. For him, there really isn't another answer. He's a self-educated man, and he says, if there is no struggle there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. This struggle may be a moral one or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without demand. Douglas says it never did, and it never will. Douglas challenges you to be skeptical, to pay attention, and to do something with your college comfort, to do what Chomsky calls speaking truth to power. Otherwise, Douglas would say, you're wasting his time and ours. And I want you to remember this. Don't waste your professor's time. I wasted mine once, and Dr. Suter is being generous, perhaps not remembering this, but the shame of wasting it stopped. It was a winter morning. It was an 8 a.m. class. There was a minor snow event at the time that you pray and cancel classes the next day, right? And it didn't. And we stayed up longer than we should have, and the class was still on. So we trudged up the hill in our sweatshirts and our jeans and our boots, and slumped in our chairs and hoped that Dr. Suda would really do the work for us. He asked questions about our reading. The room was quiet. No one made eye contact. He called on a few of us in the front row. This is not the moment you want to sit in the front row when you haven't done the reading. And we hung our heads. And he began to lecture. We just plowed ahead. He seemed to notice our sleepy disinterest, and then he dismissed us. He said, you're wasting my time. Very calmly. And he told us to leave. And we did. And I'm sure that some of us were very excited to go back to bed, to crawl back into our dorm rooms. But I wasn't. He never mentioned it again after that class. But I have read every book I've come across, every student paper on my desk, even every memo with intrigue and interest since, feeling that shame of those lost moments I had when I didn't show up ready to learn. Because I don't think that the time is unlimited. In the class that Dr. mentioned was Poetics of the Self, one of our assignments was to write our biography backward. Basically, Dr. Suga gave us the day of our death and said, what do you want to do with it? In my case, it was 2002. And this is what I wrote. February 5th, 2002, 11:07 a.m. Melissa Scholes died peacefully on the balcony of her parents' beach house. I gave my parents a beach house. In her favorite wooden high-back chair in Key West, Florida, fastest up to Florida. She was found smiling with a copy of Mrs. Galloway in her lap, Hesse at her feet, and the complete collection of Rosario Castellanos poems by her side. Melissa had just returned from a language studies program in Costa Rica and was looking forward to her second round-the-world backpacking trip. Melissa left a note in which she expressed her only regrets, mastering only 4 languages, writing only 2 novels, and not reading all of her books for the 3rd time. I've outlived myself by about 15 years, according to that date, and I've had a lot of adventure, I've had a lot of books, just as I hoped, but I've had a lot more. A lot of friends, a lot of heartbreak, a very faithful partner, earnest students, a very good daughter. Daughters, and now I need to finish my next novel and to make sure that my life is in service to those that I have a responsibility to teach and to speak for. As in Dr. Suda's seminar in my class, we begin work immediately. Time is not unlimited. It's slow and it's urgent all at the same time. After Douglas, we read Audre Lorde, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," which is pretty much the best title ever, because it's a thesis statement also. Because after my students understand their responsibility to critically think, they are often afraid to speak up. The cost may be too high. They've been sent to college to seek degrees, and degrees get you jobs, they help you pay off your college loans, and they help you buy the American dream. But their voices are often unsure. The Lord tells us that your silence will not protect you. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we're still afraid. So it's better to speak before we say. In my creative writing class, my students, they're ready to speak. They have much to say. Instead, they have to learn how to listen to their inner writers, not their social media ones. We begin with Rilke, who's one of my favorite poets, who advises us that there's only one single way. You have to go into yourself. Search for the reason that gives you right. Find out whether it's spreading out its roots in the deepest places of your heart. Acknowledge to yourself whether you would have to die if you were denied, if it denied you to write. This, above all, ask yourself, in the stillest hours of your night, must I write? You delve into yourself for a deep answer. And Rilke says, if you don't have to write, you have to do something else with your life. My students, they want to be writers, and they want to be hers. They want someone to listen to their stories just as I do, and they want someone to understand their hearts. Readers are waiting until eagerly that the work is actually yours. And writing a novel isn't something anyone can do for you or teach you how. You have to teach yourself. Writing isn't about sitting with your journal in a coffee shop, although sometimes it is. My students want to get discovered that way with their journals, and I can tell you that no agent, no editor, and no publisher has ever tapped on the shoulder of a student with a journal in a coffee house and said, "Show me that." Instead, it takes you knocking on a lot of doors. And I think this is always one of the benefits of being a first-generation college student is sometimes you don't know any better. So you just knock louder. I didn't know that you don't just call up the editor of the Atlantic and say, "I have a story I'd like you to read." I didn't know that. And you rejected the first 20 or 30. But you took one. Actually, the one he took, he did not take. He told me because it wasn't finished. He said it's a great story, but you should probably just turn this into a novel. So when the editor of the Atlantic says no, but yes, you turn it into a novel. That's not actually how writing works. It's not about the coffee shop. It's not necessarily about seeing your name on the cover of a novel, although I will admit that's a pretty cool thing too. It's actually about solitude. It's about willing to forego fun, turn off Netflix, as tempting as it is, and sit with yourself for days and years on end until you can make sense of the mistakes that you've made on the page and fix them. Because you have to make those mistakes on the page and you have to get a really bad draft done in order to make any progress from the draft. And you have to have faith that you can fix the words somewhere, someday, somewhere down the line. It helps to have childcare and home care in order to write. I've written a novel with a baby nursing on my lap, but it is not an easy task. The depth of your mind that you have to reach in order to write something well is not something that everyone would choose. I want you to find out what you love to do, the way that I love to write, and just figure out how to do that in your own book. That I think will make you happy. Rilke warns you not to seek answers and counsel from someone else for your life's direction. They won't give you the right answer. And the truth is, you have to live with you. You're the one who has to face it. Maybe fame or fortune will make you happy, but Rilke and I both doubt it. Living intentionally, being responsible for your direction, living inward, leads to the love. I just assume every person I meet is walking through it. And I just don't know their story yet. But if I do, I will know that. Find a room, as Virginia Woolf insists, even if it's only located in your mind. Your years at Monmouth will pass faster than you can imagine. On one fine spring day, my senior year, I was packing my final boxes, and I panicked. Because the scariest day of your life is actually not when you start college. It's 4 years from now, when people really stop telling you what to do, and you need an answer. I had double majored in history and government. I earned magna cum laude credentials. I was awarded the Davenport Prize for history for research. And yet, as I was packing those final boxes, I ran to Dr. Suda's last office hours. And I remember that he was packing boxes too. I don't remember if he was moving offices or what the purpose was, but he wasn't expecting anyone to come to find the office hours for the semester. So I showed up, I was terrified, I was not brave, I didn't have the answers. And he moved some boxes aside, and I explained to him that I didn't have a plan. I literally was going to graduate. I'd fallen in love with this guy who was called Jack Kerouac. He didn't seem to be having a big future either. We were both a little lost. He moved the boxes aside, Dr. Suda did, and let me sit down. And I told him how scared I was. And he leaned back, he smiled, he had these smiling eyes as I talked to him. And he put his fingertips together. And I think he probably was holding back a laugh at his wisdom matched with my nervous head. And he told me that I'd be fine. He said I would be fantastic because they had taught me how to think. And that was the entire job at Monmouth College, was to teach me how to think. And I think he's right now. I didn't then, because I didn't know any better. But Monmouth College has taught me how to think. And that's the thing that I value every day in my job as a professor, in my role as a parent, and in my success as a writer. So if you remember nothing else from today, remember this: make mistakes, take risks, recalibrate. You see someone walking across campus talking to squirrels, make friends with them. They will teach you a lot. Forgive yourself and others. Listen really hard when you disagree with someone, because your instinct may be